All right, buckle up, folks. Today we're diving into one of those wild, almost unbelievable moments from the air war over Europe. It's August 1943, and the once mighty German Luftwaffe is starting to feel the heat. The guy at the center of this story is Adolf Galland, a fighter ace, a straight shooter, and one of the few men in Nazi Germany who wasn't afraid to tell their superiors the truth, even when they didn't want to hear it. Now the man he had to report to was none other than Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal himself. Big uniform, big medals, even bigger ego. Goring loved to think the Luftwaffe was untouchable, that no enemy could ever reach deep into German airspace. But Galland? He'd been around. He'd flown through hell and back, fought in the Battle of Britain, and seen firsthand how fast technology could flip the balance of power. By mid-1943, Galland had started noticing something strange. American fighters were showing up farther and farther into Europe. The bombers they escorted weren't just hitting targets in France or the Netherlands anymore. They were pressing deeper, closer to the German heartland. And among those fighters, one stood out, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Sleek, fast, twin-engine, deadly at altitude, and here's the kicker, it could go the distance. You see, up until then, German command had one huge comfort blanket, range. The Luftwaffe believed Allied fighters simply couldn't escort bombers deep into Germany. They thought those big bomber formations would have to fly in alone, unprotected, once they went past a certain point. That made them easy pickings for German interceptors. And that belief, that arrogance, was what kept Goering sleeping easy at night. But Galland saw the writing on the wall. He'd seen the wreckage, the contrails, the encounters, and he realized that some of these American fighters weren't turning back. They were hanging in there longer, covering their bombers all the way, and making life hell for the Luftwaffe.
So Galland does what a good officer should do. He goes straight to Goring and gives it to him straight. He tells him, "Sir, we've got long-range fighters coming in. The Americans have found a way to stretch their range. We're seeing P-38s and P-47s operating much deeper than before." And Goring? He practically laughs. He waves his hand and says something like, "Impossible. No fighter can fly that far. You're imagining it, Galland." He even suggests maybe those aircraft got lost or were damaged bombers misidentified by his own men. Imagine that. The guy running the Luftwaffe refusing to believe his top ace. The man who's literally in the sky fighting these battles just because the truth didn't fit his narrative. That's how far denial had set in at the top of Nazi Germany's air command. And here's where it gets even more tragic. Goering's disbelief meant inaction. The Luftwaffe didn't adapt. They didn't accelerate long-range defense tactics. They didn't upgrade their intercept strategies. So when the full force of American fighter escorts started hitting later that year, the P-38s, the P-47 Thunderbolts, and eventually the P-51 Mustangs, it was a slaughter. Galland wasn't just warning about airplanes, he was warning about the end of the Luftwaffe's dominance. And Goering, blinded by pride, just couldn't accept it. By that summer, you could already feel the change in the air. Luftwaffe pilots were dying faster, their fuel reserves were thinning out, and bomber raids were creeping closer and closer to Berlin. But Goering kept insisting everything was fine. Galland must have felt like he was watching a slow-motion car crash. He knew the skies were shifting, and that the Germans were running out of time to react. And that's where we'll pause for now, because this warning, this one moment, is the spark that sets off a whole chain of disasters. In the next part, we're going to go deeper into how those long-range P-38s actually pulled off what Goring called impossible, what life was like for Luftwaffe pilots trying to counter them, and how Galland's words would come back to haunt the German high command.
All right, so picture this. It's late summer 1943. Germany still looks strong on paper. The Luftwaffe has thousands of aircraft, aces with hundreds of kills, and a sense of pride built on years of dominance. But in the shadows, something's shifting. Across the English Channel, American engineers and pilots are rewriting the rule book. The P-38 Lightning, yes, the twin-boom beauty with those turbocharged Allison engines, wasn't just another fighter, it was a damn statement. It could climb like a rocket, dive like a hawk, and fly longer than almost anything else in the sky. The Americans had been tweaking it for months, testing out drop tanks, tuning the engines, finding ways to extend its range, all so their bomber formations wouldn't have to face the Luftwaffe alone. By mid-43, those tests started paying off. The P-38s weren't just skirting the edge of occupied France anymore. They were escorting bombers deep into German-held territory. Galland's radar operators, his intelligence guys, even his own pilots were picking up on it. There were reports of dogfights happening hundreds of miles from where any short-range Allied fighter was supposed to be. At first, Göring's inner circle didn't buy it. They thought Galland was exaggerating, or worse, panicking. Göring himself was the worst of them all. He'd been out of the cockpit for years, and his pride in the Luftwaffe was tied to its myth of invincibility. So when Galland stood there in that conference room, probably with a map full of red pins showing Allied incursions, Göring just waved it off. "Impossible," he said. "The Americans don't have that kind of range. You must be mistaken." Galland must have clenched his jaw, biting back the urge to say what he really thought. He'd seen the wreckage, he'd read the gun camera footage, he'd talked to his men. Those weren't imaginary P-38s, they were real, and they were coming in hot. Now here's where it gets fascinating. The Luftwaffe's strategy at that time depended on bomber formations arriving alone. Their Bf-199s and FW-190s were short-range interceptors, fast, deadly, but not built to linger.
They'd climb high, pounce on bomber streams, tear them apart, and head home before running out of fuel. But if American fighters could now stick with those bombers all the way to the target and all the way back, then the whole German air defense strategy was toast. That's what Galland was trying to say. He wasn't just pointing out new airplanes, he was warning that the very nature of the air war was changing. And if the Luftwaffe didn't adapt, they'd lose control of the skies. Meanwhile, over in Allied territory, you can imagine the excitement. American fighters were finally getting the chance to take the fight all the way. No more watching bombers get shredded while they had to turn back because of fuel.
Now they were flying alongside them, matching range for range, mile for mile. The P-38 squadrons, especially those flying out of England and North Africa, were starting to test their limits, pushing further into enemy airspace, and every mission proved the same thing. The impossible was happening. By late August, German civilians in Western Germany were looking up and seeing something they'd never seen before. Dogfights right above their heads. That sense of safety they'd felt, knowing their cities were out of fighter range, was gone. The Americans were literally rewriting air warfare, one sortie at a time. But inside Göring's headquarters, the arrogance held firm. Orders didn't change. Strategy didn't change. The Luftwaffe was still being told to fight the old way, intercept the bombers, break formation, get out fast. No adaptation, no adjustment, no long-term plan.
And here's what that meant on the front lines. German pilots, many of them teenagers by this stage of the war, were scrambling to intercept massive formations of B-17s and B-24s. But this time, they weren't alone. They dived toward the bombers, and before they could even get into position, they'd get jumped by P-38s and P-47s screaming out of the sun. The hunter had become the hunted. Galland knew it. Every mission report coming in proved his point, and every one of Göring's dismissive remarks made him grind his teeth a little harder. And there's this chilling bit of irony. Galland wasn't some anti-Nazi rebel. He wasn't trying to undermine Göring for political reasons. He was a soldier, loyal, professional, brutally honest. He wanted to win. He wanted his pilots to have a fighting chance. But he was surrounded by men who thought loyalty meant agreeing with stupidity. By the end of August 1943, the cracks were showing. The Luftwaffe wasn't just bleeding aircraft, it was bleeding faith. Pilots were starting to whisper that Göring didn't understand the air war anymore, that the high command was out of touch. And when a fighting force starts doubting its leadership, you're already halfway to losing. Galland kept pushing, but Göring's ego was immovable. He believed what he wanted to believe, and reality was just a nuisance.
By September 1943, Galland's warnings weren't just theory anymore. They were a reality, roaring through the clouds over Germany. The American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were striking deep into the Reich's industrial heart. Ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, rail yards, all of it. Targets that Göring swore were untouchable were now under fire. And this is where the nightmare really began for the Luftwaffe. Let's rewind a few weeks before the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. German air defense was already stretched thin. They had radar stations picking up formations crossing the channel almost daily. Fighter groups were scrambling, exhausted, sometimes flying 3 or 4 sorties a day. But now, the Americans weren't turning back at the same points they used to. They were flying deeper and longer. And when the German fighters tried to strike, something new happened. They got intercepted. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot in August 1943. You take off in your Bf-109, climb hard into the thin air, and spot a formation of B-17s, the flying porcupines, bristling with guns. You line up your attack, and before you can even open fire, a pair of sleek, silver twin-boom fighters, P-38s, drop in from above. The tables turn in an instant. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was fighting for survival in its own sky. Galland's reports were pouring in. He wrote about these encounters, described the new American tactics, the extended range, and how their escort fighters weren't just hanging back anymore. They were diving straight into the fight. And what did Goring say? The same thing he'd said before: impossible. But on August 17, 1943, that impossible became undeniable. That day, the USAAF launched a double strike. Two massive bomber groups, one heading for Regensburg to hit the Messerschmitt factories, and another for Schweinfurt to target the ball bearing plants that kept German machinery running.
It was one of the most ambitious operations the Americans had ever attempted. A daylight raid deep into enemy territory with minimal escort coverage. And for the Luftwaffe, it was both a victory and a wake-up call. They tore into those bomber streams with everything they had. Dozens of German fighters fell, but they destroyed over 60 American bombers in one day. It was brutal, the sky littered with smoke trails and falling debris. But Galland saw past the victory. He knew this wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The Americans had shown they could reach deep inside Germany and still hit their targets. And every month, their tactics and their fighter range were improving. When the reports landed on Göring's desk, you can almost picture him puffing up his chest, saying, "See, we destroyed them. Our fighters are still unbeatable." Galland probably stared at him in disbelief, because what Göring didn't understand was that America could replace those losses fast. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and California were cranking out planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. And soon those bombers would come back, not just with P-38s, but with even deadlier escorts. But even after the Schweinfurt raid, Göring refused to accept the truth. He blamed his pilots. He accused them of cowardice, saying things like, "When I see American bombers flying over Germany, I get angry, not at them, but at my own men for letting it happen." You can imagine how that went over. German fighter pilots, exhausted, undertrained replacements flying against endless waves of American bombers, hearing their supreme commander say they were the problem. Morale hit rock bottom. Galland couldn't stay silent any longer. He confronted Göring again, this time with cold, hard data. Distances, altitudes, engagement times, all proving that long-range American fighters were operating deeper than ever. And Göring's answer? The same as always. It's impossible. But by the fall of 1943, the word impossible was becoming a joke among the pilots. Every time someone spotted a new Allied fighter over Germany, they'd say, "Oh look, another impossible plane." That's how far the confidence had crumbled. And let's talk about the American side for a moment. Over in England, USAAF planners were watching all of this unfold and learning. Every raid taught them something new about fuel consumption, escort coverage, enemy tactics. The P-38 Lightnings were already doing the impossible, but the P-47 Thunderbolts were getting drop tanks now too, stretching their range. And somewhere in a factory back in the States, another machine was being perfected, one that would change everything. The P-51 Mustang. But for now, in mid to late 1943, Galland was still fighting a losing battle, not against the Americans, but against his own leadership. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. The factories couldn't replace pilots fast enough. And Göring? He was still putting on parades, speeches, and pretending everything was fine. By the time winter rolled in, the myth of German air superiority was fading fast, and Galland knew that once the Americans brought true long-range escort coverage to their bomber raids, the Reich skies would belong to someone else.
Winter 1943. The sky over Europe is no longer German blue. It's gray, heavy with contrails, smoke, and the echo of engines that don't belong to the Luftwaffe anymore. Adolf Galland stands by an airfield somewhere near the Ruhr, watching his last squadrons limp home, fewer every week. The young ones, boys barely out of training, land with wide eyes and trembling hands. The veterans, well, there aren't many of those left. And up above, the impossible has become everyday reality. American P-38 Lightnings now escort bombers from England to Germany and back. P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks do the same. And then, like a storm breaking, the P-51 Mustang arrives, sleek, long-legged, deadly. It can fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin, fight off the defenders, and still make it home for dinner. For the Luftwaffe, it's the beginning of the end. Göring, still wrapped in his medals and delusions, refuses to face it. He holds meetings in grand halls, barking orders that make no sense, while his airmen die trying to defend a sky that no longer belongs to them. Every time he looks out the window and sees American contrails above the Reich, he's reminded of Galland's warning, the one he laughed off as impossible. And you can bet Galland remembers too. He's furious, not just at Göring, but at the blindness of command. He'd tried to warn them back in August 43. He'd said, the enemy's coming with long-range fighters. He'd begged for more production, more tactics, better planning. But Göring chose pride over reality, and pride doesn't shoot down bombers. By 1944, the skies are a killing field. The Americans own the daylight. The RAF owns the night. The Luftwaffe is just trying to survive. Galland's frustration finally boils over. He openly argues with Göring, tells him straight up that the Luftwaffe's collapse isn't the pilot's fault, it's the leadership's arrogance.
It's the failure to adapt, to listen, to believe what's right in front of your eyes. And Göring, he can't handle that kind of truth. He demotes Galland, sidelines him, calls him defeatist.
But it's too late. The truth is already written across the sky in vapor trails. By the time Allied troops cross into Germany in 1945, the Luftwaffe is a shadow. Its planes scattered, its pilots exhausted, its fuel tanks empty. The once mighty air force that terrorized Europe has been humbled, shattered by the very arrogance of its leadership. And somewhere in those ruins, Galland watches the fall, bitter, disillusioned, but vindicated. Everything he warned about had come true. The long-range P-38s he mentioned in 1943 had been the first signs of a storm that destroyed the Luftwaffe completely. History's got a way of rewarding the realists and punishing the dreamers. Galland was a realist, and Göring, he was a dreamer drowning in his own pride. And that's the haunting lesson here, folks. In war, and honestly in life, denial is deadlier than any bullet. The sky doesn't care about your pride. It only respects the ones who see what's coming and act before it's too late. And that's how one man's warning, ignored in the summer of 1943, became the echo that marked the fall of the Luftwaffe. If you enjoyed this story and love learning the untold moments of World War II, those raw, human, and powerful stories that history books just brush over, then hey, hit that like button. It tells me you want more stories just like this. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We've got so many more hidden tales coming your way, from the skies of the Pacific to the ruins of Berlin. Each one a piece of history brought to life, one voice at a time. Thanks for watching, my friends. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay curious, stay bold, and remember, the past still speaks, if you're willing to listen.